The storm that night didn't sound like rain. It sounded like something pounding from beneath the earth. The church bell swung on its own, tolling a single note that made the windows hum. Mara entered the sanctuary after hearing the noise, her flashlight trembling as it painted the pews in sickly yellow light. The air was cold enough to see her breath. At the altar, Pastor Graves was already there, kneeling in silence. His lips moved, but no sound came out, only the wet slap of water dripping from the rafters above. Then she saw it. A hand, slick and pale, reaching up from under the pulpit. The smell hit her next, like rot trapped beneath the floorboards. The pastor slowly turned toward her, his collar dark with blood. His eyes looked empty, as though someone else was staring through them. Would you still trust your pastor after seeing that? The next morning, the church stood silent beneath the gray dawn. Word spread quickly through the town, whispers crawling through diner booths and gas station counters. They said the pastor had collapsed, that the church floor was slick with blood. But no body was found. Mara hadn't spoken a word since. She sat in her small farmhouse kitchen, hands clasped, unable to wash away the image of that pale hand reaching from the dark. Every creak of the old wood beneath her feet sounded like someone moving below. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. In the silence, she could still hear the whispering from the church. It didn't sound human. Pastor Graves awoke in his bedroom hours later, the rain still pounding against his window. His collar lay folded neatly on the nightstand, though he didn't remember removing it. He could feel something damp on his chest, and when he looked down, he saw muddy handprints smeared across his shirt. His pulse quickened as the wind groaned through the walls. There was movement under his bed, soft, irregular breathing. When he leaned down with trembling hands to look beneath, all he saw was darkness, and then two glassy eyes reflecting his own. Elias Turner returned to the church alone that afternoon. He'd worked there 40 years and wasn't about to let superstition close it down. The door creaked louder than he remembered. He lit a lantern, the flame trembling against the walls. The smell of damp wood and iron filled his lungs. Beneath the pulpit, where the hand had appeared, he found loose boards. He knelt and pried one up. Beneath it, the earth wasn't dry. It was wet, freshly disturbed. He pressed his ear close and froze. Something down there was breathing. By nightfall, Mara couldn't keep away. The church's silhouette loomed in the fog, a black wound against the sky. Her flashlight beam danced across the gravestones as she approached. Inside, it was colder than the night air. The pews creaked softly, as though welcoming her back. Her breath caught when she saw the altar, fresh candles burning, though no one had been inside since morning. And there, written across the floorboards in ash and blood, were words that chilled her to the bone. He's not dead. Sunday came like a wound reopening. The townspeople filled the pews with uneasy smiles, pretending not to notice the faint stain that still darkened the altar floor. Pastor Graves began the sermon as though nothing had happened. His voice was calm, measured. But every time he mentioned forgiveness, the lights flickered. Mara sat near the back. Her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles went white. She felt it again, that cold breath crawling up her spine. Behind the pulpit, she swore she saw the boards shift, ever so slightly, as if something underneath was moving. When the pastor raised his hands to bless the congregation, his sleeves fell back. There were scratches on his arms, deep and fresh. That evening, Mara walked home through the fog-drenched fields, clutching her coat tight. Every gust of wind carried the faint echo of the pastor's sermon, words repeating themselves in her head. Halfway down the dirt road, she stopped. Footsteps. Soft, slow, matched hers. She turned, but the road behind her was empty. Then came the faint sound of someone breathing. Close, too close. Her flashlight flickered once and went out. She whispered his name, but only the cornfields answered. Pastor Graves sat in his office long after the congregation had gone home. His desk was littered with old photographs, smiling faces from baptisms, weddings, funerals. At the bottom of the pile was one picture he shouldn't have kept. Him holding his son, Nathan, years after his supposed death. He traced the boy's face with trembling fingers. The candles flickered, though no wind moved. Behind him, the confessional door creaked open by itself. Inside, a faint voice whispered, "You promised." Elias Turner returned that night to fix a leaking pipe in the church basement. The sound of dripping water echoed off stone walls. But when he reached the end of the corridor, the pipe was dry. The noise was coming from behind a wooden door he'd never opened before. It looked older than the rest of the building, built from rough planks and sealed with iron nails. He pressed his ear against it and froze. There was someone on the other side, whispering a prayer he didn't recognize and crying. The next morning, the town awoke to rumors again. Some said Elias had vanished. Others swore they saw him walking through the graveyard before dawn, carrying his lantern, though the church was still locked. Mara stood outside the chapel gates, staring at the windows. From within, she could hear a voice, soft and broken, repeating the same words again and again. She pressed her ear to the door. The voice was Pastor Graves, but the words weren't prayers. They were names. Every name in the congregation. And hers was the last one he spoke. For 3 days, the church stayed closed. The doors were locked, but every night, the bell rang once, always at 3:00 a.m. Mara couldn't sleep. She kept hearing whispers outside her window, calling her name in a tone that wasn't human. On the 4th night, she went back to the church, lantern in hand. Inside, the air was colder than winter. The confessional box stood open, its curtains swaying gently, as if someone had just stepped out. She reached inside with shaking hands and found a small notebook, bound in leather, soaked dark with something that wasn't water. On the first page, written in the pastor's handwriting, was a single phrase. "Forgive me, Father, for what I brought back." The next morning, Mara brought the notebook to Elias's house, hoping for answers. But when he opened the door, his eyes looked distant, foggy, as if he hadn't slept in days. He denied hearing any bell, denied seeing the pastor. His lantern sat on the table behind him, still burning, though it was broad daylight. When she asked about the church basement, he went silent. His lips trembled, and then, barely above a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't have found that book." That night, Pastor Graves recorded a sermon on an old cassette deck. His voice was calm, though the words trembled with something unnatural. The tape whined, distorting every few seconds, turning prayers into static. Between verses, a faint second voice bled through, a whispering echo that repeated his every word an instant late. He froze when he heard it clearly say his name. He rewound the tape, pressed play again, and listened. This time it wasn't his voice that followed. It was Nathan's. Mara returned to the church after dark, unable to resist the pull. She opened the confessional again, this time sitting where the priest would. The smell of damp wood filled her lungs. On the other side of the thin divider, a low voice began to whisper, asking for forgiveness. At first, she thought it was the pastor. Then she heard the voice tremble and realized it sounded younger. She pressed her ear against the divider. "Nathan," she whispered. The voice stopped. Then, softly, it whispered her name. The next morning, Elias found the church doors wide open. The pews were overturned, hymn books scattered. At the altar, the confessional curtain hung in shreds. The notebook Mara had found was gone. And on the booth's wooden wall, carved deep with a blade, were new words, written as if by multiple hands, shaking and desperate. "He is beneath us." Outside, in the graveyard, a patch of fresh soil had been dug up beside Nathan's old headstone. Elias knelt, hands trembling, and realized the coffin was missing. The next Sunday, the church reopened. The townspeople came reluctantly, drawn by habit more than faith. Pastor Graves stepped up to the pulpit, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The crowd noticed his voice trembled, the way his hands shook when he lifted the Bible. Behind him, faint scratches marred the wood where "He is beneath us" had been carved. As he spoke, the candles flickered violently. The sound system began to hum, a low, unnatural frequency that made stomachs twist. Then, for just a moment, everyone in the room swore they heard a second voice echoing behind his, whispering each word just after he spoke it. After the sermon, Mara confronted the pastor outside near the graveyard fence. He smiled faintly when he saw her, but his expression didn't match his eyes. She demanded to know where the notebook was, what it meant, and who was buried, or wasn't, under the church. He avoided every question, his gaze fixed on something behind her. When she turned, the cemetery looked the same, but every cross seemed slightly tilted, as though the earth beneath them had shifted. The wind picked up, carrying a faint, childlike giggle across the field. That night, Pastor Graves dreamt of his son again. Nathan stood in the pews, smiling, his skin pale and bruised. "You said you'd bring me back," the boy whispered. "And you did." "But not all of me." The dream felt too real. The air heavy with the smell of rain and rot. The pastor fell to his knees, clutching his chest, as Nathan's smile widened. When he woke, he was still on the church floor, drenched in sweat. Mud covered his hands and shoes. The graveyard door was open. Elias returned to the basement after midnight, lantern shaking in his hand. He couldn't ignore the noises anymore, the slow, dragging sound like claws over stone. The walls seemed damp with something darker than water. Near the far corner, he found a new tunnel, freshly dug, leading into blackness. His breath quickened. He called out the pastor's name. The echo came back distorted, layered with another voice. Then, from the tunnel, a small, trembling whisper replied, "Help me, Elias." Mara woke in the middle of the night to the sound of church bells again. 3 sharp tolls that echoed through the fields. She threw on her coat and ran toward the sound. The church door was open, swinging in the wind. Inside, Pastor Graves stood before the altar, whispering to something unseen beneath the floorboards. His eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight. When he saw Mara, he smiled, too wide, too calm, and said, "He's almost ready to walk again." Before the sickness took his son, Pastor Graves had been a good man. But desperation can rot faith faster than sin. Late one stormy night, when Nathan's breathing had grown faint, he prayed not to God, but to whatever would listen. And something did. It came as a whisper in the dark, promising a cure. The next morning, Nathan opened his eyes. He smiled weakly, but his skin was ice cold, and his pulse never returned to normal. The townsfolk called it a miracle. Samuel called it mercy. But deep down, he knew mercy shouldn't come with eyes that never blinked. In the following weeks, the boy got stronger, too strong. Animals went missing near the parsonage. The pastor's sermons grew darker, his eyes emptier. When Nathan's mother began to notice the smell of decay in their home, Samuel told her to stay away from the basement. She didn't listen. The scream that followed never left his ears. He buried her quietly behind the church, told the town she had gone to care for her sister in Tennessee. Nobody ever questioned it. In a town that's small, faith was stronger than curiosity. Years later, when the sickness returned, Samuel tried again to pray, but the voice that answered wasn't the same. It demanded something more this time. Devotion, obedience, sacrifice. That was when he began locking himself inside the church for hours, whispering prayers that weren't in any Bible. He'd stopped calling it God. He started calling it the Keeper. The Keeper promised eternal life, but only through blood. And Samuel, blind with guilt and faith, twisted beyond repair, agreed. Mara discovered the truth through an old ledger hidden inside the church archives, burial records that didn't match the town's cemetery. 7 names, 7 disappearances, all after the supposed miracle. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, recognizing one final entry, dated 2 days ago. It was her own name. The ink wasn't dry yet. Somewhere above her, the church bell began to toll. That night, Mara confronted Pastor Graves one last time. She found him inside the sanctuary, standing before the pulpit with his son beside him. Nathan's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, his skin almost translucent. "It wasn't meant for him," Mara whispered, voice trembling. "Whatever you brought back, it's not your son." The pastor smiled sadly. "I know," he said, "but he's all I have left." As thunder cracked overhead, the floor between them began to split open, revealing the black soil underneath, pulsing like a heartbeat. The storm that night never ended. The church bell tolled on its own, louder with every flash of lightning. Inside, Pastor Graves stood at the altar with his hands raised toward the rafters, eyes rolled back, lips moving faster than any prayer Mara had ever heard. The air felt thick, heavy with something alive. Nathan stood beside him, unmoving, a faint grin twisting his pale face. Mara stepped forward, screaming for him to stop, but her voice vanished in the roar of the thunder. And then the floor beneath them groaned, boards splintering as a dark mist began to pour upward from the cracks. Elias burst through the doors, clutching his lantern, shouting over the storm. "Stop this madness, Samuel," he yelled, but the pastor didn't turn. The lantern's light flickered wildly as the mist thickened, swirling around Nathan's feet like smoke. The boy's skin began to darken, veins pulsing beneath the surface. His mouth opened, releasing a low, guttural sound that wasn't human. The candles shattered in their holders, glass flying through the air. Elias fell to his knees, whispering a prayer, but the words turned to ash on his tongue. The voice that came from Nathan wasn't his own anymore. It filled the entire church, deep and echoing, rattling the windows. "You called me," it said. "You begged for me. Now you'll feed me." Pastor Graves collapsed, clutching his chest as the thing inside his son stepped forward. Mara ran to him, but the floor split again, a jagged chasm opening between them. Black tendrils of smoke reached out like hands, curling toward the pastor's body. He looked up at Mara one last time, whispering, "Forgive me." Then the tendrils dragged him under. The church began to collapse, the roof beams cracking under the storm. Elias grabbed Mara's arm and dragged her toward the door, shouting for her to run. Behind them, Nathan screamed, a sound not of pain but fury, echoing through every wall. The stained glass shattered, and the black mist poured out into the night. As they stumbled through the graveyard, the church tower split in two. From the wreckage, something began to crawl out. Something wearing Nathan's shape, but far too tall, its eyes burning like coals in the dark. They reached the road, soaked and shaking. Mara turned back once and saw the church engulfed in darkness. Not fire, but shadow, thick and pulsing. A single bell rang again from within the ruins, though the tower was gone. Elias fell to his knees, coughing blood, whispering, "It's not over." Mara looked toward the horizon. The storm clouds had vanished, but the sky still churned with movement, something crawling beneath the stars. And from the forest beyond town came a child's laugh. The town woke to silence. The church was gone. Nothing left but a smoldering pit where the foundation had been. Mara and Elias stood on the hill above it, their clothes stiff with ash. No one else came to see the ruins. No one wanted to. The sheriff asked questions, but there were no answers that made sense. They said lightning hit the tower. They said gas leak, but everyone in town knew better. That night, the air still smelled of burnt wood and blood. Somewhere deep below the ground, the bell rang once. Mara stayed in town longer than she should have. She couldn't sleep, couldn't leave the churchyard behind. Elias begged her to go, but she couldn't shake the feeling something was unfinished. Every night she heard faint footsteps on her porch, the sound of someone breathing near her window. On the third night, she followed it, barefoot into the field. The wind was still, the world too quiet. Then she saw him, Nathan, standing at the edge of the cornfield, barefoot and smiling, as if waiting for her to come closer. He didn't move when she approached. His voice, when it came, was soft and childlike. "It's not over," he said. "He's still here." Mara shook her head, tears streaking her face. "Your father's gone," she whispered. Nathan tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, smiling wider. "He's inside." And then his eyes changed, turning from dull gray to deep, familiar blue. Pastor Graves' eyes. Mara stumbled backward, realizing too late that she wasn't speaking to Nathan anymore. Elias arrived at Mara's house just before dawn. The door was open, swinging in the wind. Inside, the lantern was still burning, its flame steady. The Bible lay on the table, open to the book of Revelation. On the wall, someone had written with black ash, "The keeper walks." He called Mara's name, but the house gave no answer. Then he heard a noise outside, the sound of the church bell, ringing from somewhere it shouldn't exist. By the time Elias reached the hill, the ground was trembling. The crater where the church once stood glowed faintly red, like embers breathing. From within the smoke, two silhouettes emerged, one small, one tall. He lifted the lantern, his voice cracking. "Mara!" The smaller figure turned. It was her, but her eyes were gone, black as coal. Behind her stood Nathan, or whatever wore him now. As the sun rose, the two shapes sank slowly back into the earth, leaving only the echo of a bell that no longer existed.